The rain arrived like a verdict that night, steady, insistent, flattening the city's lights into a wash of silver and ink. Naomi Carter stood in the doorway of the penthouse she had helped make into a home, coat clinging to her shoulders, water beating on the leather strap of her bag. The apartment smelled of lemon oil and the faint trace of her own lavender perfume. And beneath those ordinary scents lay something sharper now, the sweet, expensive perfume that was not hers, the quiet pride of a woman who had come to take what she wanted. She had not planned a scene. She had rehearsed one in her head 1,000 times. The dramatic confrontation, the cinematic glass-shattering cry, the vindicating accusation. Instead, she felt small, rooted to the polished parquet as if the floor had become quicksand. Her hands found the doorframe and clutched it like an anchor, while the room spun with the hum of the refrigerator and the far, civilized laughter of a life that had been slipping through her fingers for months. On the king-size bed lay two bodies tangled with the casual intimacy of routine. Ethan Cole, tall, impeccably tailored, white-collared and white of face in the lamplight, rolled onto his side and watched her with the same flat composure he had used to negotiate deals. Beside him, Sierra Lane propped herself up on an elbow, hair silk-pressed and eyes bright with triumph. She wore Naomi's silk robe, the one Naomi preferred on Sunday mornings when Ethan was still in town. The sight of it felt obscene. Domesticity made mockery. For a moment, Naomi could not find a sound. Her breath moved in paper-thin pulls through her chest. Light from the terrace slashed across her shoes, then crawled up the wall and revealed the photograph on the nightstand. The one of Naomi and Ethan at the museum gala the year they met, smiling with practiced ease, her hand on his arm. The frame had been turned inward. A new photograph faced outward, a staged holiday snapshot of Ethan and a woman Naomi did not know. The image was a punctuation, erased, replaced. "You've been home," Ethan said, and there was an almost casual regret in his voice, the way a man might apologize for bad weather. "We were going to tell you this weekend." Naomi's world narrowed. She had come to believe in the grammar of their lives, the commas and the semicolons, the way holidays and anniversaries stitched two persons into a marriage that looked plausible, durable. That grammar had been rewritten without her consent. "You're leaving?" she asked, because the simplest questions still felt like anchors. Ethan's face softened for a fraction of a breath, the smallest human flicker, and then his expression corrugated into that practiced, measured cold. The look of a man who could compartmentalize tenderness for negotiation. "She's moving in," he said. "I want a divorce. My lawyer will be in touch." The words landed with the muted authority of a court summons. Naomi felt each syllable as if it were a stone dropped into the hollow she had been living in. Around them, the apartment continued to breathe. The kettle's faint whistle in the kitchen, the distant thrum of a car idling on the street below. Normality wore its unremarkable face, indifferent. She could have screamed. She could have wept, pleaded, promised reinvention, or threatened litigation. She did none of those things. Naomi had long ago learned that the most corrosive betrayals do not always demand noise. Sometimes they demand a quiet, deliberate reclamation. She closed the door softly behind her, and the sound was not a retreat so much as a seal. Whoever had read her life as a chapter to be annotated had misjudged the margin. She was not margin material. Outside, the rain glossed the city's glass towers into mirrors of themselves. She walked to the terrace, removed her heels, and let the cool concrete kiss her bare soles. The wind made a slow, sad music through the planters. A stray newspaper page skated across the courtyard like a white gull. Naomi pressed her palm to the cold steel of the railing and tasted the metallic tang of fear and something fiercer beneath it, the faint, stubborn ignition of possibility. In the weeks that had led to this night, the small humiliations had accumulated into a dossier, a joke, an aside, a hand held too long around another woman's waist, the business trip scheduled with surgical vagueness, the comment to a colleague that had lodged in Naomi's mind like grit. "I polished her up. She looks good on the arm." She had swallowed each slight, smoothing the edges of her pride until it felt like a necessary polish. But tonight that polish had been stripped away, and laid on the bedroom table like an accessory to be discarded. She let the rain wash across her shoulders. Tears did not come at once. They pooled behind the ribs, heavy as fruit. When they came, they were not loud. They were private. Naomi allowed herself the mercy of a small, contained unraveling. A run of hot salt down her cheeks, a tightening at the throat. Then she wiped her face, breathed as if counting to a new life, and tucked the night's tender, aching truth into a softness she would later shape into resolve. There was freedom in the decision that swelled quieter than any shout. She would not let this be the story that defined her. She had, for years, edited herself into a role that had never fit her skin. The woman who left that room did not leave broken. She left with a plan as clear and unadorned as a compass needle. Reclaiming would not be instantaneous. It would be work. She would collect the fragments, passport, grandmother's locket, a few photographs not of the life she used to perform, but of the life she wanted to build. And she would go somewhere the sky felt like it could hold a new story. Before she stepped back through the French doors into the indifferent light of the living room, she looked once more at the bed that had been the stage of her unmade life. Naomi squared her shoulders, tasting salt and rain and the small, clean, metallic tang of resolve. She spoke softly, not out of defeat, but with a cadence that felt like the beginning of a sentence she would finish for herself. "You'll see me again," she said, "but not as the woman who stayed." If Naomi's first step moves you, if you feel the pull of beginnings and reckonings, share a thought below. And if you'd like to follow her journey, consider liking and following the channel for the next chapter. Your quiet company matters, and there are more pages to come. The memory arrived like a bloom, impossible to stop once it had opened, soft as champagne bubbles and just as bright. Naomi could still feel the warmth of that first evening, the way the chandelier light had skittered across the marble hall and made every face look important. It had been in Chicago, at a benefit for a youth arts program. Naomi had been there on purpose and by habit. She ran logistics for events then, a woman who loved the quiet architecture of details, where a napkin fold could change a conversation, how light found a face and made it remembered. She had spent years crafting spaces where strangers felt at home, stitching together atmosphere from linens and music and the small, unshowy engineering of hospitality. He had come late, the kind of entrance that belonged to men who were used to having the room rearrange itself in their presence. Ethan Cole, white, tall, with a laugh that suggested confidence as much as ownership, moved through the cluster of donors with the ease of someone who had never learned the word hesitation. Naomi remembered watching him from across a table of canapes, hands deftly folding place cards, and thinking, simply, that his tie did not match his eyes in the most ordinary, discomfiting way. He noticed her because she did not notice him in the way other women did. She was not performing for him. She was doing a job, and something in his practiced self recognized a competence that was not commodity. They had spoken like two people who had been given a second to exchange truths. He about his work at an investment firm that balanced risk like a composer balanced notes. She about the tiniest triumph of the evening, the way a centerpiece had landed exactly as she'd envisioned. He listened with a rapt, unhurried attention that felt like sunlight. He invited her to the after-party. He asked the right questions, not the clumsy ones that looked for purchase. He made her feel seen. In the evenings that followed, courtship unfurled with an almost cinematic generosity. There were helicopter rides, silent, impossibly intimate, over the lake, dinners in rooms where no one else could find them, a proposal on the rail of a private yacht off Nantucket, when the sky hung low and merciful. It felt like being chosen, which for a woman who had polished her ambitions under the sober light of practicality, felt dangerously like a miracle. Naomi accepted with the swiftness of a person who had learned to grasp the rare and keep it. She had thought then that the story of her life would rearrange its margins to include his. She believed in the promise implicit in the ring and the name change that followed, that love could be a bridge to a kind of ease she had imagined but never touched. Interior design studies were shelved. Contracts she had negotiated were left unsigned. The small loft in Atlanta where she had kept sketches and fabric swatches, filled with boxes marked "someday," a future she would pivot back to, she told herself. Instead, the pivot became a plateau. Gratitude curdled into a certain servitude. She learned to make introductions at galleries and to smile in the glow of other people's admiration, achieving a particular professionalism at playing the part of the supportive spouse. At first, it was seductive, how a partner's ambition could make your life shimmer by association. Parties filled with discreet laughter and important names became the new scaffold for identity. Ethan introduced Naomi as his partner, his anchor. People said things like, "She's exactly what he needs." There is a pleasure in being called essential. It felt like a mantle. Naomi pressed herself against it. She learned the lexicon of their circles: charitable initiatives, discreet investments, patron lists, and she curated herself to fit. But the slow erosion began in the gestures no one thought to mark. The hand on a small of a colleague's back that lingered too long. The way he praised her efficiency in front of friends with the acne of a compliment that landed like a dismissal. She keeps things running. He bought her books she had not chosen, small gifts that were more object than understanding. He called her to tell her details about the house, new drapes, a chandelier, while she translated their home into a stage for his colleagues and clients. Naomi found herself smiling at jokes that did not touch her, arranging flowers in colors that did not speak to her soul, learning to nod where she once would have argued. There were quieter betrayals, the ones that felt surgical because they came wrapped in concern. When she suggested returning to work, part-time, to consult, not to surrender their life, he would frown with the same paternal gentleness as someone diffusing a child's dangerous enthusiasm. "You don't need to work," he would say, as if the sentence were a lifeline. "You have me." It was a sentence that sounded like protection, but functioned as containment. Naomi had spoken once of a small design studio she yearned to open, and he had applauded it, at the gala, in a way that made other guests murmur, and then made arrangements that made it impossible. They moved into a penthouse where the rent would swallow any startup capital. Friends who might have offered internships were politely kept at a distance. The change crept into Naomi's bones. She woke to mornings that smelled of bleach and coffee, walked past pristine corridors lined with indifferent art, and realized that the interior life she had once designed with fierce love was becoming a set in someone else's play. In the private spaces, she noticed the slow accumulation of things not her own. Gifts with embroidered monograms, photographs angled just so, an empty chair that always seemed to be placed to flatter a guest's posture. Gratitude muttered in her chest like a litany, but beneath it something else, an insistence, began to stir. She remembered the afternoon she overheard Ethan at a boardroom lunch, sipping his wine and laughing with men whose names were familiar only because Naomi had learned to attach polite faces to titles. He described her with the loose arrogance of someone who believed he had invented another human being. "We found her doing events, raw talent, polished her up, gave her the right frame." The words reached her like a stone thrown at a window. They did not shatter the glass, but they made the whole house tremble. In that tremor, Naomi found the beginning of a rebellion that did not explode, but braided itself into resolve. That rebellion was not immediate. It was a whisper, a question that would not be silenced. Who chooses you when you are not being chosen as a decoration? She began to keep small things again, sketches folded into her purse, a little portfolio of fabrics tucked under a sofa cushion. She practiced saying, privately at first, sentences that belonged to her. "I am not only what he needs." It felt both ridiculous and indispensable, like practicing a dialect of a language one meant to claim. Even in the early years, Naomi's love for spaces, how they could cradle an emotion, how a lamp's angle could coax a conversation, remained. It had always been the truest thing about her. In the hush between their plans and the parties, in the small hours when she could not sleep because the house was too loud with absence, she would open her notebook and sketch a corner, imagining what she might design if her life were entirely her own. Those sketches were fragile resistances, private, stubborn glyphs of a woman who had once built room after room, not to please a husband, but to answer to herself. Love had, in its early light, felt like an invitation. Over years, it became a demand. The invitation closed, quietly and almost imperceptibly, until Naomi felt the pressure of a life that was not exactly wrong, but not exactly hers. It is a peculiar ache to be loved for the way you complete someone else's sentence, while your own paragraph dissolves into margin notes. That ache, small and steady, would grow into the force that one night in the penthouse turned into a decision that would alter the grammar of Naomi's life forever. The cracks never appear all at once. They begin as hairline fractures beneath the gloss, invisible to anyone who isn't looking closely. To the world, Naomi and Ethan Cole were still the picture of contemporary grace. A marriage framed in muted gold, polished by magazine features and the practiced choreography of social appearances. Yet behind the polished glass of their life together, something quiet and corrosive had begun to spread. It began, as most endings do, with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that drapes itself between two people who have run out of tenderness and still insist on pretending they haven't. Ethan's voice, once a steady current in her days, became a series of distant updates. Flight itineraries, market reports, reminders for social events that no longer belonged to her joy. His words had turned utilitarian, efficient, stripped of the small gestures that once built intimacy. Naomi answered with the same rehearsed calm. The conversations were exchanges of information, not emotion, like briefings between two diplomats maintaining a fragile treaty. Still, she performed. She had learned performance the way some people learn prayer, through repetition until it becomes reflex. She smiled at the right moments, stood half a step behind him in photographs, and laughed softly when the moment demanded charm. It was easier that way, to follow the script than to improvise in a scene that had lost its meaning. But inside, she began to notice the dissonance, the faint hum of falseness vibrating beneath every gesture. When Ethan's hand rested on the small of her back at a charity dinner, the warmth that used to travel up her spine now felt like the weight of obligation. His touch had turned possessive, not protective. And in that shift, Naomi felt herself shrinking, like a photograph fading beneath sunlight. It was at a winter gala that the illusion began to shimmer and peel. Naomi had planned every detail of the evening, the cascading orchids, the velvet lighting, the music that melted into conversation. She stood near the stage, watching guests swirl in their gowns, when she caught sight of Ethan across the room. He was talking to a woman Naomi didn't recognize. A young associate, perhaps, with laughter that rose too easily, too intimately. His hand lingered on the woman's wrist. Naomi knew that gesture. It was the same one he used when he wanted a person to feel chosen. The moment was brief, ordinary to everyone else. But for Naomi, it carved through her composure like a blade made of light. She felt her stomach tighten, her chest constrict, and the familiar self-doubt whisper its old, poisonous question. Maybe you're imagining it. She had learned, over years, to doubt her instincts, to trust in appearances, to believe the story they both told. But that night, the glass she had been polishing for years began to hum with the pressure of all that denial. Later, in the car, Ethan spoke of investments and mergers, his tone as steady as ever. Naomi watched the city lights blur against the window, her reflection a ghost among them. She tried to find herself in the glass, tried to locate the woman she had once been. But all she saw was a stranger wearing the right dress, saying the right things, nodding at the right intervals. A woman perfectly trained to be invisible. The next morning, she found a hotel receipt in his briefcase. 2 nights at the Mandarin in Miami, a dinner for 2, champagne for the room. She held it in her hand for a long moment, her pulse unsteady. When Ethan walked in, she asked without accusation, without tears. Who was she? He didn't flinch. He looked at her as though she were a mild inconvenience in the middle of his morning routine. A colleague, he said. You're reading into things again. Don't make this ugly, Naomi. The calmness in his tone was worse than anger. It was dismissal, the subtle cruelty of a man so accustomed to control that he could weaponize gentleness. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But something in her refused the comfort of that lie. The receipt lay between them like a tiny, irrefutable prophecy. That night, Naomi stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom. The reflection looked flawless. The hair, the posture, the jewelry glinting at her throat. She had perfected the art of looking whole. But behind the gloss she saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible fissure in her composure. Her eyes looked older, Not from age, but from exhaustion, the kind that comes from loving a person who no longer sees you. She thought of her mother's words, spoken years ago in a small Georgia kitchen. A woman can survive almost anything, baby, except being unseen. Naomi finally understood what that meant. To be unseen was to be erased while standing in plain sight. She began to watch more carefully. The small pauses when Ethan checked his phone. The way his smile flickered when she entered a room unannounced. The perfume on his suit that was too sweet to be her own. The cracks widened with every unspoken truth. Still, Naomi said nothing. She was gathering evidence not of his betrayal, but of her own disappearance. Every slight became a mirror, showing her how much she had traded for belonging. She remembered the notebooks of designs she had tucked away, the unfinished sketches that once defined her dreams. She took them out one evening, smoothing the creased paper as if touching an old version of herself. The pencil lines felt alive under her fingertips. She had not drawn in years, yet her hands remembered. It was there, at the edge of her own silence, that Naomi began to sense the outline of a different kind of courage. The kind that doesn't come from confrontation, but from remembering. Remembering what it felt like to be whole, before being halved by someone else's definition of love. By spring, the fractures had spread through the marriage like veins through marble, beautiful from afar, irreparable up close. They went to dinners together but sat like strangers, surrounded by friends who complimented their elegance. Naomi smiled, a ghost behind her own face, while Ethan laughed too loudly at stories that weren't funny. The room reflected their perfection back at them, and no one saw how hollow it had become. Sometimes, when he left for business trips, she would stand at the window long after his car had disappeared. The city moved below her, vibrant and unsympathetic, full of people living their own small freedoms. She would press her hand to the glass, feeling the cold against her skin, and whisper to herself, not yet a promise, but almost one. There has to be more than this. And somewhere deep within, under the weight of appearances, under the obedience of love turned duty, Naomi felt something begin to shift. A pulse, faint but undeniable. The sound of a woman beginning to awaken inside her own silence. The morning light came soft and deceptive, gilding the city in a calm it did not deserve. Naomi woke alone, the sheets beside her cool and undisturbed. Ethan had already left for a meeting, another one of those endless cycles of suits, phone calls, and promises whispered to people who weren't her. For a moment she lay still, tracing the ceiling with her eyes, trying to remember when waking up had stopped feeling like a beginning. The penthouse was beautiful, of course. Everything in Ethan's life was. But it carried that sterile silence that followed wealth too carefully curated. She had designed parts of it herself. The muted palette, the textured walls, the abstract art chosen for balance. But the beauty had turned against her. It had become a set built for a performance that no longer had an audience. The first proof came quietly, almost politely, as though the universe wanted to give her one last chance to turn away. She found it while tidying his office, an errand she'd taken on more from habit than devotion. A folded sheet of paper slipped out from between two financial reports. It was a printed email confirmation from a hotel in Miami, dated the same week Ethan had been speaking at a conference in Boston. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. The reservation was for a suite with an ocean view. The line that gutted her most was small and unassuming. Dinner for two, champagne upon arrival. 2. The number stared at her with an arrogance only truth can possess. Naomi sat at his desk, her pulse loud in her ears. It was absurd, she thought, how something as simple as a receipt could dismantle years of denial. She read it again, just to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. Then she folded it, smoothed the edges, and placed it neatly back where she found it. Her dignity demanded at least that much ceremony. All that day, she rehearsed conversations in her mind. Some were sharp and cinematic, her voice steady, his expression caught between guilt and awe. Others were softer, born of a desperation to understand, to make sense of the senseless. But when evening came and he walked through the door, smelling faintly of cologne and confidence, all she could say was, "How was Boston?" He kissed her cheek distractedly, murmuring something about a successful meeting. Naomi studied his face, The faint tan he shouldn't have, the relaxed ease of a man who'd been somewhere tropical, somewhere unburdened. "I found something today," she said, her voice thin but steady. "A hotel receipt. In Miami." Ethan froze, just for a second, but his recovery was swift. He leaned against the counter, his smile measured, patient. "You're reading too much into it," he said. "I extended my layover to meet a client. We had dinner by the ocean. It was work." She looked at him, at the calm precision of his lie. "Two guests, Ethan. Champagne in the room." His eyes hardened, though his tone remained gentle, the kind of gentleness that cuts deeper than cruelty. "Naomi, you've been tense lately. You imagine things when you're anxious. Don't do this to yourself." There it was again, the quiet gaslight disguised as concern, the implication that her pain was not real, only hysteria shaped into accusation. Naomi said nothing more. She felt herself shrinking, as if her heart were folding inward to protect its last untouched corner. He went to shower, humming under his breath. The sound of running water filled the apartment, a curtain drawn between them. When he emerged, he looked impeccable again, as though sin could be washed off with soap and charm. "Let's not ruin tonight," he said. "We're expected at the Mitchells for dinner." And like a well-trained actress, Naomi nodded. The performance must go on. At dinner, laughter rose around the table like champagne bubbles. Naomi smiled when spoken to, replied with practiced warmth. Only once did her composure waver, when a waiter uncorked a bottle of champagne and poured it into her glass. The sound of the cork, the scent of the drink, it was too precise, too cruelly specific. Afterward, as they drove home through the city's glittering arteries, Ethan rested his hand lightly on her thigh, as if nothing had changed. Naomi stared out the window, her reflection split between glass and streetlight. She wondered when she had last felt the right to flinch. That night she couldn't sleep. The bed felt too large, the silence too loud. She rose, walked barefoot into the kitchen, and sat at the marble counter, the city sprawling below like a restless animal. The proof of his betrayal sat somewhere in that office drawer, but she didn't need to see it again. Proof was not what she lacked. What she lacked was denial, and she wasn't ready to let that go yet. In the mirror above the sink, she caught her reflection. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes, her mother's eyes, held the truth she could no longer swallow. There was a war beginning inside her, quiet but certain. Over the next days, Naomi tried to live as if nothing had shifted. She attended luncheons, replied to emails, arranged flowers in perfect symmetry. Yet each gesture felt foreign, hollowed out. She began noticing details she had trained herself to ignore. The faint lipstick mark once smudged on his cuff, the way he angled his phone away when texting, the perfumed trace in the air when he left a room. Denial, she discovered, was not ignorance. It was endurance. It was waking up every morning and choosing the comfort of lies because the truth would require rebuilding everything from dust. But even endurance has an expiration. One afternoon, she caught him on the phone in the living room. He didn't see her standing in the doorway. His voice was low, intimate, colored with that indulgent tone he no longer used with her. "I'll see you soon," he said softly. "Don't worry, she doesn't suspect a thing." The sentence was a knife, simple and efficient. Naomi felt the cut and stayed utterly still, as if movement might make the wound real. When he hung up, she retreated soundlessly to the balcony, where the wind could disguise her trembling breath. The sky was pale, the kind of fragile blue that pretends at peace. Naomi leaned against the railing, feeling the pulse of her own blood. There were no tears this time, only a clarity sharp enough to taste. She had spent years polishing their life until it gleamed. Now she could see every crack in the glass, and behind it, the reflection of a woman she had almost forgotten. Her heart ached, but within that ache was something new, the faintest flicker of defiance. She didn't know yet what form it would take, only that she would no longer let herself be rewritten by someone else's lies. And as the evening light settled over the city, soft and deceptive once more, Naomi understood. Proof is never the end of love's story. It's the beginning of liberation. They called it an amicable separation before it was anything of the sort. The phrase was practiced, wrapped in the language of civility, to soften the fact that Naomi's world had been cordoned off and inventoried like estate property. It began with a meeting in a glass office where light mapped her silhouette onto the carpet in a way that made her feel like a photograph being examined. Ethan's lawyer, suave, polite, a man who had spent his life translating endings into clauses, spoke slowly, as if he were unfolding something delicate. "The prenuptial agreement is clear," he said, handing over a stack of pages. Naomi felt the paper as if it were warm. The ink smelled faintly of boardroom coffee. The prenup, signed the week before the wedding in a flurry of affection and champagne, was meticulous in its exclusions. The penthouse, the accounts, the art, his. Her name, a polite footnote. She read the language that had been drafted for her with a new kind of literacy. Waiver of interest in premarital assets, spousal maintenance capped, release of claims upon divorce. The words were precise, surgical. A settlement offer, small, framed as a gesture of goodwill, was placed on the polished desk. The number was round and polite, an amount that could not buy dignity but could rent silence for a season. Naomi felt the room tilt. She wanted to rage, to tear the contract into confetti and scatter it across the firm's marble floor. She wanted to make a spectacle of the man who had rewritten their life without asking. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and forced her face into composed lines. The world had taught her the economy of restraint, that fury spent poorly could be turned against you in a courtroom or in the court of social opinion. Outside, Atlanta kept its indifferent hum. Inside, the lawyer's chair scraped softly as he rose. "We advise acceptance," he said with the air of a physician delivering prognosis. "Contesting will be costly and uncertain. This amount, well, it's reasonable." The word echoed oddly, like someone had left a glass to ring in an empty room. The days after were a choreography of humiliation. Friends she had spent late mornings with over coffee. Women who had complimented her taste in linens, who had toasted her as a charming presence at galas, offered condolence in measured tones. Their messages arrived in polite strings. "I'm so sorry, darling. If you need anything." In their eyes, she was becoming a cautionary tale they could perform sympathy around. Margot Winters, whose laughter had once been embroidered into Naomi's life, kissed her cheek with practiced softness and said, "You'll bounce back, Naomi. You're far too talented not to." Polite, distant, necessary, empty. Then the invitation arrived. Heavy cardstock, type embossed in that cursive she had once designed and approved for Ethan's firm's philanthropic soirees. "Ethan Cole and Miss Sierra Lane request the pleasure of your company at their engagement celebration." The date was less than a month away. Naomi looked at the looping handwriting at the bottom, the afterthought. "No hard feelings. Would love for you to see how happy we are. XS." The note was a small, careless blade. She should have burned it. She should have thrown it into the trash unread. Instead, the invitation unfurled in her like something she could not help but read to its end. Curiosity, that dangerous private vice, twined with an ache that was almost academic. She needed to witness the architecture of her own erasure. On the night of the party, the penthouse, her former home, had been transformed with the shrug of someone redesigning a stage set. The abstract paintings she had chosen were slid against storage walls. Modern neon installations had replaced the soulful corners she had once curated. What had been a tableau of restraint was now a tableau of appetite. Naomi walked into the swell of young voices and charged laughter, as if stepping through a different time zone. The breath of the room smelled of expensive perfume and ambition. She wore a black dress from a high-street shop, unadorned and deliberately humble. Her hair was pulled back. She wanted anonymity, not revenge. She wanted to be a ghost in the crowd, to place the invitation back in the envelope of her memory and move on. But being invisible required attendance from those who would perform her disappearance. Ethan and Sierra were at the room's center, a small constellation of admirers orbiting them. Sierra's laughter cut bright. She wore Naomi's robe earlier, now a borrowed story, now a joke. When their eyes found Naomi's across the room, for a beat Naomi saw a sliver of surprise in Ethan, quickly smoothed into the practiced blankness of men who deal in appearances. Sierra's face, however, bloomed with a cruel, youthful certainty. "You came." Her voice was syrup and glass. Up close, she was newly perfected. Cosmetic smiles, the practiced tilt of a chin. I'm so glad you could make it. We did some redecorating. It's much fresher, don't you think? Feels younger. Laughter swelled. Around them, the room's energy pulsed with the permission to enjoy someone else's misfortune as spectacle. Naomi's throat tightened. The old script of shame wanted to curl like smoke through her ribs. Shame that she had allowed her life to be curated for display. Shame that she had been readable as a triumph for someone else's taste. But something else, newly fierce, opened behind that flinch. A steadiness that felt like bone. She could hear the words she had practiced in lonely hours, the private protests she had dared to whisper into her notebook. I am not only what you polished. She did not make a scene. Instead, she performed an act far more disarming. She smiled, a line like a blade she'd acquired the hard way, and nodded at Sierra as if to acknowledge a civility between women who had nothing more to give each other. Naomi turned slowly, letting the light slide off her shoulders. For one beat, she felt the eyes of the room follow her, measuring the fall they had been entertained by. She heard the laughter then, thin, excited, like a thing that had fed. In the stairwell, the cool air wrapped around her. She stepped outside onto the darkened street and tasted rain on the wind. It came like absolution. Her feet carried her to the river where the city's reflection did not flatter her. It told the truth of movement, not permanence. Naomi let the tears come then, not the hot theatrical sort, but clean salt that washed the edge of shame from her lips. She breathed in, and the night's salt and damp felt like the first honest thing since the house had started to glitter without her. She gathered what belonged to her over the next days, not the silver that bore his monogram, but the private reliquaries. Her passport tucked into the lining of a weekend bag, her grandmother's locket, a packet of photographs that showed a girl she once had been, less careful, less perfect, but wholly herself. Each object she packed was a small exclamation point, a line break in the paragraph someone else had been drafting for her. The fall from grace was not a singular moment. It was a sequence of small defeats and the way the world looked when it decided you were no longer its preferred thing. But in that descent, Naomi found a curious clarity. She had been polished into a surface that reflected better light. Now, stripped of veneer, she could see edges. Between the fracture and the future, there was, finally, possibility. The night she broke was not loud. There were no slammed doors, no shattered glass, no echoing arguments torn loose from love's carcass. It began, instead, in the hush that follows exhaustion, a silence so deep it seemed to breathe on its own. Naomi had spent weeks moving through the residue of her former life, her existence reduced to errands and formalities. Signatures, storage boxes, polite farewells offered by people who could not look her in the eye. She had grown used to the rhythm of collapse. It came in predictable beats, one moment of false calm, one moment of suffocation, and then the slow, practiced return to composure. Yet that evening, something felt different. The composure no longer fit. It pressed against her like clothing 2 sizes too small, tight and airless. The city was humming outside, restless with weekend traffic. Naomi sat at the edge of her bed in a temporary apartment she could barely afford, the single lamp throwing long shadows across the floor. A half-packed suitcase lay open beside her, the zipper gaping like an unanswered question. She had been collecting herself piece by piece, but the pieces refused to make a whole. The memory of that engagement party still clung to her like perfume that wouldn't wash off. Sierra's laughter, Ethan's effortless charm, the polite applause of onlookers watching the theater of replacement. It replayed in loops whenever Naomi closed her eyes. For days she told herself she didn't care, that she had walked away stronger, freer. But freedom, she was learning, is not immediate. It is a slow, painful detox from everything that once defined your belonging. That night she received a message, a photo, forwarded accidentally from an old mutual friend. Ethan and Sierra on a balcony, champagne glasses raised. A caption that read, "Power couple of the year." Naomi stared at it. The image was too perfect, a tableau she had once belonged to, and something in her, something long pressed into silence, began to tremble. She set the phone down carefully, but her hands would not stop shaking. The tears, when they came, surprised her. They weren't the delicate, cinematic kind. They were raw, convulsive. Years of swallowed apologies and unspoken anger breaking through the skin of composure. She pressed a hand to her chest as if to hold herself together. Her breath came shallow, almost panicked. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full, unvarnished grief. Not for Ethan, not for the marriage, but for the woman she had lost in the process. The woman who had once dreamed in colors, who had drawn worlds from imagination, who had believed that love was a place one could build and live inside forever. She wept until her body stilled, until the tears dried into salt on her skin. When she looked up, the city lights had softened to amber through the blinds. The world beyond her small window kept turning, oblivious. And Naomi realized that heartbreak, for all its cruelty, was also an opening. A dismantling of walls that had kept her from herself. She stood, bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, and walked to the mirror. The face staring back was unfamiliar, not because it was broken, but because it was new. There was no pretense left, no carefully managed serenity, just a woman stripped to her essence, raw, trembling, alive. She whispered to her reflection, her voice steady, despite the hoarseness. I will not be erased. It wasn't a declaration of revenge. It was something deeper, a reclamation. Over the next few days, Naomi began to move differently. She went for walks without a destination, noticing the way light fell on brick walls, the smell of street food drifting from corner stalls, the distant laughter of strangers. These small, unguarded moments stitched themselves into her, reminders that life existed beyond loss, that beauty could survive ruin. Still, the past haunted her in small ways. Ethan called once, his tone warm, conciliatory, the practiced kindness of a man who wanted to tidy the narrative of his own cruelty. I hope you're okay, he said, as if concern could rewrite history. Naomi listened quietly, letting the sound of his voice wash over her like static. When he said her name, Nay, in that soft, familiar way, she felt the ghost of old tenderness rise and fall within her. Then she hung up. No anger, no speech, just finality. Later that week, she found herself outside the art supply store she used to visit years ago, before her marriage had become her profession. She hesitated at the door, her reflection framed in the glass between fluorescent light and night sky. It felt foolish, almost childish, to step inside. Yet she did. The smell of paper, graphite, and paint was an embrace she hadn't realized she'd missed. She bought a single sketchbook and a set of pencils. That night, she opened to the first blank page and just stared. Her hand hovered, uncertain. Then, slowly, she began to draw. Not anything deliberate, just movement, lines, curves. The graphite whispered against the paper, and with each stroke, she felt something loosen inside her. It wasn't art yet, but it was freedom in its first, trembling form. When dawn arrived, she was still at the table, surrounded by soft pencil dust. Outside, the horizon bled pale pink into the clouds. Naomi smiled, faintly, the kind of smile that comes from exhaustion and clarity. She realized she had crossed an invisible threshold. The breaking point had not been a single shattering. It had been a surrender to truth. It was understanding that survival was not about holding the pieces together, but about letting them scatter until only what was essential remained. A week later, she returned to the river, the same one she had walked beside after the party. The air smelled of rain again, the kind that carries both cleansing and memory. Standing by the railing, she looked down at the water reflecting the skyline, fractured, shimmering, alive. For the first time, she didn't see her reflection as loss. She saw movement, continuity. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, the wind tugging at her coat, her hair lifting slightly around her face. Somewhere in that quiet, Naomi felt the pulse of something that had been dormant for too long. Self-respect, not as defiance, but as peace. That night marked the end of one life and the beginning of another, though she didn't yet know what shape it would take. All she knew was that she had finally stopped waiting for an apology, for recognition, for closure. The world had cracked open, and through the fracture, light was beginning to pour in. Naomi's disappearance was neither cinematic nor melodramatic. It was meticulous, deliberate, a quiet unmaking and reassembling done with the care of someone who had learned to steward small truths. She did not flee in a storm of suitcases and shouted goodbyes. She left like a person closing a book they had read too often, turning pages slowly, marking what to keep, folding corners of the chapters that mattered. The settlement money arrived in a neat electronic transfer 2 days after she signed the papers, a number that could not stitch back the years, but would buy her a beginning that was not rented on someone else's terms. She counted the digits with a steadiness that felt almost ceremonial, then treated the balance like a compass. It would not buy oblivion, but it would buy distance. Distance, she decided, would make the contours of herself legible again. She chose a motel that first night, an impersonal room with a lopsided lamp and a threadbare throw, the kind of place where no one knew your name. The bed smelled faintly of lavender and another person's regrets. Naomi lay awake until dawn, the city outside muttering through its pipes, and for the first time in months allowed herself the luxury of not performing. She let her hands search for the outline of her life, the way a woman might trace constellations she had once loved and neglected. In the drawer beside the cheap lamp, she tucked a few things: her passport, the locket that had belonged to her grandmother, 3 small notebooks filled with sketches and margin notes, evidence, proof that the Naomi who loved texture and light still existed beneath the gloss. Packing was an act of selection, not scarcity. She did not gather the monogrammed linen Ethan had given her, nor the shoes stacked like little altars in their closet. She stowed away the private reliquaries of self: a worn pair of headphones, a scarf dyed in colors she loved, a stack of handwritten letters from a past that had been less complicated. She folded a dress she had once worn to a gallery opening, not because she planned to wear it again, but because it reminded her of the woman who had taken up space willingly and without apology. When she closed the suitcase, it felt like closing a door on a room she had furnished for someone else. The latch clicked with the exact sound of an ending. Naomi sat on the bed for a long time, feeling the hollow where certainty had been, listening to the motel's distant radiator cough and the restless sigh of travelers. The decision to leave was a kind of kindness to herself, to the fragile embryo of life she hoped to grow. At the small counter, she paid cash, evading the polite questions the clerk offered. She liked the anonymity of that exchange, a name that would not show up on any guest list, a face the clerk would not remember. Outside, the morning had that thin, washed-out light that makes cities look contemplative. Naomi walked to the subway, a single suitcase in tow, and let the motion of the train ease her forward. Each station blurred like a smear of watercolor until she emerged into the airport's bright anonymity. Her ticket was one way. The agent raised an eyebrow, a subtle, almost pitying lift, but did not question her. She booked the earliest flight with a connection that would land her in Lisbon in the late afternoon, at a time the city would feel forgiving and slow. She chose Lisbon not for romance, but for resilience, a place that had been rebuilt from rubble, where reinvention was inscribed in the stones and the steep alleys held stories of survival. It felt, to her, like permission. On the plane, she let herself fall into the soft fog of jet lag and strangers breathing. She watched clouds unfold like white pages, thinking of margins and margins for error. Memories arrived in small, uncontrollable shards. Ethan's voice in the kitchen, the sound of laughter at a party that had once felt like applause, the way her hands had once smoothed linen with a tenderness that had become duty. Instead of clinging to them, she folded them into herself like paper boats sent down a river, sent, not sunk. Lisbon received her with late light and the smell of salt and baked bread. The airport felt smaller, friendlier. The taxi driver's grin was generous, the way people are generous in cities that speak to the heart of strangers. The cab climbed narrow streets and descended into neighborhoods tiled with blue and gold, facades painted in colors she had only seen in her sketchbooks. The city's geometry was defiant, stairs that led where no map promised, alleys that breathed out toward the river, and Naomi felt the tightness in her chest loosen with each turn. Her apartment, an attic studio rented sight unseen, was modest. Whitewashed walls, a small balcony that looked out over terracotta roofs, a bed with a simple linen throw, a kitchen the size of a novella. There was no grandeur here, only a single, patient room that would hold her imperfect attempts to rebuild. She carried her 2 suitcases up 3 flights of worn stone stairs, muscles burning deliciously from movement that was solely her own. When she opened the balcony door and stepped out, the air tasted like possibility, salty, bright, and honest. That first evening, she walked until her feet remembered the rhythm of wandering. She navigated lanes lined with laundry and the cry of street vendors, and in a small cafe, with sunlight slanting like a benediction, she ordered coffee in rough Portuguese and smiled when the barista answered in English with a kindness that felt like an invitation. She sat with her sketchbook and drew the curve of a tram, the way its shadow bent against an ochre wall. The graphite on paper felt like a quiet liturgy, the reintroduction of hand to habit. Night came soft and without drama. Naomi stood on her tiny balcony, the city unfurling beneath her in a scatter of lights, and allowed the ache that had been constant to recede by inches. She thought of Ethan not with sharpened hate, but with a strange, distant compassion. An admission that the man who had made her small was perhaps a man who had never known how to be large enough for both of them. She held the locket in her palm until the metal warmed to her skin and felt, for the first time in a long while, the small, steady pulse of something like peace. Disappearing, she discovered, was less about vanishing and more about arriving at a life that belonged to you alone, arriving at mornings that began because you chose them. The town's lights blinked below like punctuation, and Naomi, with a softness that surprised her, closed her sketchbook and began to imagine the room she would build, not for anyone else's admiration, but for the person she was becoming. The first thing Naomi noticed about Lisbon was its sound, not a noise but a rhythm. The city moved like a song sung under the breath. Trams clattering on cobblestones, gulls circling the sky with their plaintive cries, the distant hum of voices spilling from open windows. It was a place that seemed to breathe in layers, ancient and modern, ruin and renewal, all coexisting in an almost reverent harmony. She had arrived hollow, emptied of everything familiar. Her first weeks passed quietly, marked by the small rituals of starting over. The studio she rented was humble but sunlit, its windows opening onto a sea of terracotta rooftops that glowed like embers at dusk. Each morning she brewed coffee in the chipped mocha pot left by the previous tenant and stood barefoot on the balcony, watching the light rise over the Tagus River. The air smelled of salt and baking bread. Sometimes, when the breeze carried the sound of church bells, Naomi felt as though the city itself was whispering, "Breathe." Lisbon had the temperament of an old soul, scarred but unashamed. Its beauty was imperfect, its surfaces weathered and freckled with time. Walls peeled, tiles cracked, but every fracture seemed to bloom with color, every ruin adorned with fado songs echoing from alleyways, like prayers sung by those who had learned to live with loss. Naomi felt at home in that imperfection. She had come to a city that had once burned, collapsed, and rebuilt itself from ashes, just as she hoped to do. At first, she barely spoke. The language on strangers' tongues was music she could not translate. She spent her days walking, Alfama's steep alleys, the long promenade along the river, the bustling squares where artists sold paintings that shimmered with impossible blues. She carried her sketchbook everywhere, drawing quietly from corners and cafe tables. Her lines were tentative at first, ghostly outlines of buildings, of women looking out windows. But slowly, her hand remembered. The graphite began to move with confidence again, and something inside her, something that had been dormant under years of self-erasure, began to reawaken. It was on one of those walks that she met Leonor Santos, an elderly woman with hair white as sea foam and eyes that laughed before her mouth did. Naomi had been sketching an azulejo facade when Leonor approached, balancing a paper bag full of oranges. "You draw the heart," she said in accented English, "not the wall." "That's rare," Naomi smiled, shy and unsure of how to answer. Leonore continued, "Come, you must have coffee. No one should draw on an empty stomach." That impulsive kindness turned into friendship. Leonore lived 2 streets down in a small apartment filled with books, plants, and sunlight. A retired literature professor, she had the kind of wisdom that made conversation feel like shelter. Over endless cups of strong coffee, Naomi listened to Leonore's stories, of revolutions, of love lost and found, of how cities and hearts could be rebuilt if one had enough patience and grace. "You cannot rebuild overnight," Leonore told her once, peeling an orange with surgical precision. "Lisbon took centuries to forgive itself after the earthquake. People are no different." Naomi began to understand. Healing was not an event. It was an architecture, one built brick by brick, gesture by gesture, choice by choice. Soon Leonore introduced her to others. Sophia, a potter who sold her work in the weekend markets. Helena, who ran a small design studio in Bairro Alto and spoke with the energy of a woman who had learned to live twice. They welcomed Naomi, not with pity but with respect. When they asked where she came from, she answered softly, "Atlanta." And when they asked what brought her here, she said, "A new start." They didn't press. In Lisbon, everyone was rebuilding something. Under Helena's encouragement, Naomi began to take small freelance projects, decorating boutique apartments, consulting on color palettes for local shops. The first time she was paid for her work again, she held the cash in her hands for a long moment before tucking it into her sketchbook. It wasn't about the money. It was about ownership, the proof that she could create value with her own hands, her own mind. Evenings became her favorite part of the day. She would walk down to the Miradoro da Senhora do Monte, where the city spread out below like a mosaic of light. She would sit on the stone wall and watch the sun sink into the Atlantic, painting the sky in layers of rose and gold. It was a place where the world seemed to pause, where endings and beginnings shared the same horizon. Sometimes, as the air cooled and laughter floated up from the cafes below, she would think of Ethan, not with bitterness, but with a distant curiosity, as one might think of a past self. The memories no longer pierced her, they passed through her gently, like wind through an open door. There was sadness, yes, but also gratitude. For without that unraveling, she might never have arrived here, in this city of salt and song, learning again how to live. One night, Leonore invited her to a fado bar in Alfama, a small, candlelit space where singers poured their grief and beauty into every note. The voice that filled the room was raw and magnificent, trembling with emotion. Naomi felt tears gather before she could stop them. Leonore leaned over and whispered, "This is saudade, the ache of what is gone, but also the love for having felt it." Naomi understood. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her past, not as an anchor, but as evidence of her aliveness. She had loved, lost, fallen, and now, here, among ruins that had chosen not to hide their cracks, she felt herself beginning to rise. Back in her apartment, she opened her sketchbook again. This time she drew not buildings but faces. Leonore's lined and luminous, Sophia's mid-laughter, a child playing by the fountain. Then finally, her own reflection from memory. Not as she had been, polished and perfect, but as she was now, tender, weathered, radiant with becoming. The city slept beneath her balcony, humming its quiet, ancient lullaby. Naomi closed the sketchbook, pressed her palm against its cover, and whispered, "Thank you." Lisbon, the city of ruins, had not just given her a new life, it had returned her to herself. Naomi's voice had been quieted so incrementally that she almost did not hear the silence where it had once lived. In Lisbon, she began the slow, deliberate work of learning how to speak again, not only in the literal sense of mastering Portuguese phrases that curled like new branches in her mouth, but in the fuller, braver sense of finding the cadence and courage to claim sentences that belonged to her alone. Mornings fell in a soft hush over Alfama. The light filtered through laundry lines and painted the stairwells in watercolor. Naomi rose before the city properly woke, boiled water for coffee, and practiced vocabulary on the creased pages of a textbook. She mouthed verbs as if they were charms: falar, sentir, viver, and when she stumbled, She laughed at herself in the small mirror above the sink. The laughter was a small reconnection, a reclaiming of sound. Each new word she learned felt like a shard of glass polished back into a window through which she could finally see. At Leonore's suggestion, she joined a conversation group that met weekly in a sunlit room above a bookshop. The group was an assemblage of exiles, locals, students, and retirees, each person carrying a small history like a notebook. There was a Brazilian architect who talked with his hands, an Irish guitarist who translated idioms with music, a Moroccan student who folded Arabic proverbs into Portuguese. For Naomi, the group was both a teacher and a mirror. When she spoke haltingly, the others listened with a kind patience she had rarely been offered in Atlanta's polished rooms. They did not rush her sentences, they let them land. Slowly, imperceptibly, her confidence threaded itself through the conversation like a new hymn. It was there she met Sophia, a graphic designer whose laugh was quick and generous, and whose hands were always slightly ink-stained from sketching. Sophia saw Naomi's notebooks, the sketches peeking from the edges like secrets, and asked a question that felt less like curiosity and more like a summons. "Have you worked with spaces before?" Naomi felt the old defensive reflex, the instinct to minimize, to explain away the years she'd spent as someone's wife rather than her own person. But this time, instead of hiding, she told the short, sharp truth. "I used to design events," she said. "I worked with light and texture and how people move in rooms." The sentence surprised her with how solid it felt. Sophia offered practicalities rather than pity. "You should update your CV," she said matter-of-factly. "Highlight what you actually did. Budgets, vendor management, guest experience. Those are skills." Naomi fetched the laptop she had been avoiding because the screen had felt like a stage she'd lost permission to stand upon. With Sophia's help, what had once read like domestic appendix was rearranged into professional language. Event design, logistics coordination, client relations, cross-cultural programming. The words were small transfigurations, grammar remapped to truth. Applying for jobs was a humbling ritual. Naomi learned how to write cover letters that were concise rather than confessional, how to stitch her Lisbon projects, a boutique apartment refresh, a small gallery opening, into a narrative of competence. Rejection arrived with predictability and sting. Polite emails that cited overqualification or cultural fit. Interview invitations that fizzled when references were requested. Each no pricked her but did not puncture. She learned to file each disappointment into a drawer labeled learning, not defeat. The first paid gig that felt honest came unexpectedly. A tiny guest house owner, charmed by Naomi's sketches and gentle insistence, asked her to redesign the breakfast room. It was not a grand commission, just a narrow space with tired curtains and a chipped table. But the work required everything she loved: color, light, the choreography of chairs, the ecology of coffee cups. She painted a mural of lemons and blue tiles with Elena, a neighbor who liked to hum while she mixed paint. They lifted a single pendant lamp to hang in the corner, measured the angle of morning sun, and chose linens that folded into soft, welcoming shapes. When the owner walked in the next morning and began to cry, Naomi realized the tears were not pity. They were gratitude for the feeling that the room now held. That small domestic miracle paid more than its modest fee. It paid Naomi's belief. Her portfolio, once private and ashamed, began to fill with honest images. An intimate courtyard wedding whose guests spoke 3 languages. A corporate dinner whose centerpieces honored each guest's heritage. A conference that felt human instead of austere. Helena Vieira, who had a studio that took on international clients and had been watching Naomi's quiet work through a mutual friend, reached out. Their first meeting was in a glass-walled cafe that smelled of roasted beans and orange peel. Helena looked at Naomi's sketches with the careful attention of a reader discovering a new poem. "You have an instinct for atmosphere," Helena said, tapping the page where Naomi had sketched a ballroom ceiling with spare telling lines. "You think like a host, but you design like an artist. We need someone who can hold both." The offer that came thereafter was not immediate. Helena proposed a trial. Oversee a small series of events at her boutique hotel, Palacio Azul, where Naomi would coordinate weddings and evening concerts for visiting clients. It was a test and an invitation both. On her first day at Palacio Azul, Naomi arrived with a sketchbook tucked under her arm and a nervous steadiness in her steps. The hotel was a ribbon of sunlight and old plaster, and Helena introduced her to a staff that had seen comings and goings, but not this kind of attentive ambition. Naomi learned to translate her ideas into spreadsheets and vendor calls. She learned the practicalities of permits and seating charts, and the diplomacy of managing anxious brides and exacting caterers. In the frantic hours before a gala, her hands moved with a clarity she had not felt in years. Where once she had been a polished accessory, she now stood at the center of a small, pulsing machine of care. Success at Palacio Azul was incremental but undeniable. The first event she led without Helena at her side flowed. Guests lingered longer than planned. Servers moved like a choreography she had devised. A string quartet complemented the exact notes she'd imagined for the entry sequence. Afterwards, a guest approached her with wet eyes and said, "You made a room where we could remember why we came together." Naomi kept the compliment like a jewel. With each project, her voice found new registers. She spoke in meetings with vendors and clients, her sentences measured and clear. She negotiated, not with the anxious tone of someone begging for permission, but with the easy competence of someone who knew the cost of each detail. When a caterer tried to drop a fee at the last minute, Naomi's refusal was quiet and absolute. She found ways to reallocate resources without sacrificing the integrity of the design. There were nights she still woke with the phantom weight of someone's disapproval pressing against her chest. But those nights diminished in frequency, replaced by evenings when she returned to her studio and unrolled fresh paper. She sketched layouts not because she had to, but because she wanted to, the way fingers absent-mindedly find a favorite chord on a piano. Friends from the conversation group came to events, not out of obligation but curiosity, and their small celebrations felt like confirmation that she was building not only a career, but a life with people who saw her whole. Finding her voice again did not mean forgetting the woman she had been. It meant weaving the past and present into a fabric that fit her better. She learned to say no without scapegoating herself, to accept help without feeling owed, to hold space for grief without letting it become her whole story. Her sentences became a kind of architecture, clear, deliberate, and beautiful. And in the quiet moments between bookings, when the city outside her window hummed with evening traffic and the smell of grilled sardines, Naomi would sit with a pencil and draw a new skyline, one she might, one day, design in full. Success, when it arrived, did not come in trumpets or headlines. It came softly, like lights slipping beneath a door. Naomi had been working at Palacio Azul for several months when Helena handed her a folder one afternoon, her expression warm but serious. "A new client," she said, "a boutique hotel near Belém. They want to relaunch their terrace space for summer weddings. It's small, but important. The owner's friends are major investors. Do this well, and everyone will know your name." Naomi ran her fingers along the edge of the folder before opening it. Inside were photographs of the terrace, a worn stone patio overlooking the Tagus, its balustrades chipped, its garden wild from neglect. She felt something stir, excitement and terror intertwined. She had learned to recognize that feeling as the pulse of possibility. The next morning, she took the tram across the city to see it in person. The terrace was even more weathered than the photographs showed. Ivy spilling over walls, a fountain long dry, the faint scent of salt rising from the river below. But Naomi saw not ruin, only invitation. She could already imagine the transformation, the lights suspended like floating stars, the table runners in linen the color of seafoam, the stone clean but left imperfect, so that time itself remained part of the design. Helena trusted her implicitly, checking in only to ask if she needed anything. "Just time," Naomi said. She began the work quietly, gathering materials, sketching layouts, meeting vendors who still mispronounced her name, but now did so with respect. She spent evenings in the empty terrace, watching how the sunlight shifted through the day, where the shadows fell, how the breeze moved at dusk. These were the details no spreadsheet could teach, the invisible choreography that gave a space its soul. Each decision carried the weight of her rebirth. She no longer worked to impress, but to express. She wanted this terrace to reflect not the wealth of its patrons, but the beauty of resilience, the way something once forgotten could be coaxed back to life. Weeks passed. The stone was scrubbed clean, the fountain restored to its soft murmur, the overgrown vines trimmed just enough to frame the view. Naomi designed lanterns from recycled glass bottles, enlisted a local florist who wove greenery into archways that looked half wild, half divine. She wrote the lighting plan herself, ensuring that no corner of the terrace would feel unloved. When the opening night came, she stood by the edge of the garden as the first guests arrived. The evening unfolded with quiet precision. Champagne poured, candles flickering in the soft wind, musicians tuning their instruments beneath the moonlight. As dusk deepened into blue, the lights she had hung one by one came alive. The terrace seemed to float above the city, suspended between sky and sea. People noticed. They always did when something had been crafted with care, invisible to the naked eye. Conversations softened, laughter rose like music, and a woman in a silk dress whispered to her companion, "Whoever designed this knows what heartbreak feels like." Naomi overheard, and a strange, gentle pride filled her. Later, Helena approached, a glass in her hand, her eyes shining. "You've done it," she said simply. "You've made something impossible look effortless." Naomi smiled, but words failed her. Instead, she looked out over the terrace, the lanterns, the river, the guests glowing under the lights, and felt a peace that was both foreign and familiar. For so long, she had been building other people's dreams, shaping rooms that reflected someone else's desires. Tonight, the space itself reflected her, the woman she had become after surviving ruin. The next morning, her phone buzzed with messages from vendors and guests alike. "Congratulations, spectacular. Who was your designer?" Helena forwarded an email from the hotel's owner. "Your team exceeded every expectation. Please tell Naomi she has a gift." Helena found her later that day in the office, barefoot and tired, arranging flowers left over from the event into small vases. "They want to work with you again," she said, smiling, "and so do two of their friends. You've started something." Naomi laughed softly, the sound almost disbelieving. "I was just trying to make it beautiful," she said. "That's exactly why it works," Helena replied. The following weeks were a blur of work. New clients arrived, restaurants, private estates, even a small museum seeking to host its anniversary gala. Each project built upon the last, her portfolio growing not in opulence but in authenticity. She approached every space like a story, the entrance as a prelude, the seating as dialogue, the lighting as emotion. Where others saw logistics, Naomi saw narrative. Lisbon responded to her in kind. Vendors began recommending her name before she even arrived. Clients trusted her with their dreams, sensing that her designs came from a place of empathy, not ego. Naomi found herself working long hours again, but these hours no longer emptied her. They filled her with purpose. Each completed project, another verse in the song she had begun to write for herself. One evening, after a long day of coordinating a charity dinner for local artisans, Naomi walked home through the Bairro Alto streets. The night smelled of jasmine and rain. As she passed a bookstore, she caught her reflection in the glass. Tired, yes, but luminous in a way that surprised her. She stopped for a moment, watching herself as if she were a character in someone else's story, one who had finally begun to believe in her own script. At home, she placed her sketchbook on the table and flipped through its pages. The earlier drawings, hesitant, uncertain, had given way to confident strokes, bold ideas. Her handwriting had changed too, sharper now, more deliberate. On the final page, she wrote a single line. "Beauty isn't what survives time. It's what teaches time to begin again." It became her quiet mantra. A month later, Helena called her into the office to share news. An international travel magazine wanted to feature the Terrace project in an article about Lisbon's hidden gems. They wanted to interview Naomi, to photograph her alongside the space she had revived. Naomi hesitated at first. The thought of public recognition felt dangerous, too close to the kind of visibility that had once consumed her. But Helena insisted. "This isn't their spotlight," she said. "It's yours." The interview was brief, the photographs gentle. The article praised her for blending modern restraint with emotional storytelling. calling her work a dialogue between memory and light. When Naomi saw the printed magazine weeks later, her name written beneath the photograph of the terrace at dusk, she felt no pride in the performative sense, only a calm gratitude, a quiet knowing that she had earned this moment, not through ambition, but through endurance. The first spark of success was not fire. It was a slow illumination, a soft warmth that spread inward. For Naomi, success did not roar, it glowed. It was the rediscovery of her own hands, her own voice, her own name, spoken without fear, shining in the language of her own making. Visibility had once been a cage. Naomi had lived inside it for years, polished, arranged, and well lit, the perfect reflection of someone else's success. She had learned then that to be seen without being known was its own kind of erasure. But in Lisbon, visibility began to take on another meaning. It did not announce itself with flashbulbs or applause. It arrived in the small recognitions that stitched her back into the fabric of a world that had once overlooked her. After the Terrace project was published, invitations started to arrive. Not the cold, obligatory ones from boardrooms or charity galas, but handwritten notes, warm introductions, personal gestures that carried sincerity instead of spectacle. People began to remember her name not because of who she had been married to, but because of what she created. Still, Naomi remained cautious. She moved through this new attention the way one wades into the tide, measured steps, testing the pull. Her days filled with projects, meetings, and calls. Her evenings with long walks through the narrow streets that had become her compass. The more she worked, the more she began to realize that she was building something greater than a career. She was building a voice, one made of texture and patience, of empathy carved from her own wounds. One morning, Helena asked her to attend a conference on women in design. "You should speak," Helena said. "People need to hear what you've done here." Naomi shook her head immediately. "I'm not a speaker," she said, smiling shyly. "Then you'll be perfect," Helena replied. When Naomi arrived at the conference hall, a modest, sunlit venue near the river, she found herself among women who carried their stories like banners. Architects, curators, painters, entrepreneurs. Their voices rose and intertwined like the colors of the city, diverse, flawed, brilliant. Naomi sat quietly through the morning panels, her notebook filling with words that moved her. When her turn came, she almost didn't stand. Her heart thudded so hard she could feel its echo in her fingertips. But then she saw Helena in the back row, smiling like someone who already knew how this moment would go. Naomi took a deep breath and walked to the microphone. The room waited. "I used to believe," she began, "that success meant being admired, that if I worked hard enough and smiled often enough, I'd be seen as worthy." She paused, steadying herself. But admiration without understanding isn't respect. It's decoration, and for a long time I let myself become that. Her voice was low but steady. Then I lost everything I thought defined me. And in that loss I found the silence necessary to listen. To myself, to others, to the spaces between. The audience was utterly still. Naomi spoke not as an expert, but as a witness. She talked about Lisbon's streets, how they taught her that beauty could grow out of ruin, how designing rooms was never just about color or shape, but about emotion, how light could teach forgiveness, how symmetry could feel like peace. When she finished, the applause rose slowly, not thunderous, but sustained, the kind that carries warmth rather than noise. Several women approached her afterward, their eyes glimmering with recognition. One, a sculptor from Porto, clasped her hands and said, "You said what I've been trying to carve for years." That afternoon, walking home along the waterfront, Naomi felt something loosen in her chest. She realized she had spoken without fear of judgment, without permission. The air itself felt different, lighter, wider, as if the city had turned its gaze toward her, not as ornament, but as equal. From that day forward, opportunities seemed to find her with a quiet inevitability. She began mentoring young designers at Helena's studio, women who reminded her of her younger self, brilliant but hesitant, creative but cautious. Naomi guided them not with lectures but with listening. She asked them what they wanted to say through their work, what silence they hoped to fill. Her schedule grew fuller, but it was the kind of fullness that nourished rather than consumed. Invitations came from universities, exhibitions, and cultural collectives. One day she received an email from Dr. Rochelle Morrison, a philanthropist from New York who was organizing an international women's summit in Lisbon. "I've seen your work," Rochelle wrote. "It's honest. You make spaces that breathe. We'd like you to design the summit's main event, a celebration of women's stories told through architecture, art, and light." Naomi reread the email twice. It felt unreal. This woman, once discarded and invisible, being asked to build a stage for voices like her own. In the months that followed, the project consumed her, but in the best way. She curated an atmosphere rather than a set, walls draped with projections of handwritten letters from women around the world, each one whispering fragments of resilience and joy. The stage was circular, symbolizing equality. The lighting shifted through gradients of dawn, representing rebirth. Naomi named the installation Resonance. When the summit opened, the room glowed with living light. Women stood beneath their own words, some reading them aloud, others simply standing still as those words wrapped around them. Rochelle found Naomi near the back and whispered, "You didn't just design a space, you built a feeling." That night, after the final applause faded, Naomi lingered alone in the empty hall. The projections still flickered softly across the walls, thousands of sentences breathing in rhythm. She sat in the center of the circle and looked up. For the first time in her life, she felt utterly visible, not for her beauty or her performance, but for the quiet truth of what she created. Later, she walked through the city as if through a dream. The Tagus glimmered under the moon. Trams clattered distantly. Laughter drifted from nearby cafes. The air was cool and sweet, and Naomi felt her name settle gently into the rhythm of the place. She was no longer a ghost in someone else's narrative. She was a voice in her own, alive and resonant. She returned home and opened her balcony doors. Below her, the city's lights shimmered like a constellation, a map of all the moments that had brought her here. She whispered to the night, "I am not hidden anymore." And for once, the world seemed to answer back. Naomi read the email twice before she let herself believe it. The sender line, Caroline Sterling, Chief Marketing Officer, Hartfield and Rowe, looked like an impossible punctuation at the end of a sentence she had been writing for months. The subject, Senior Event Strategist, New York. The message was crisp and professional. It spoke of cultural reimagining and a search for someone who could translate corporate ambition into human experience. Dr. Rochelle Morrison's recommendation sat at the bottom like a benediction. For a long moment, Naomi sat on the narrow bed of her Lisbon studio, the morning light falling in a strip across the floorboards, and felt the world tilt in the most ordinary way, toward possibility. She pressed her thumb across the trackpad, opened the reply, and wrote with a steadiness born of practice. She would come for the interview. Her breath felt like the word yes. Lisbon receded under clouds and ocean, until Manhattan rose in its place. Glass and steel in a sky that looked like the possibility of every city she had ever sketched. Hartfield and Rowe's headquarters were a tower of reflective surfaces that captured the Hudson's quicksilver and threw it back at the skyline. Naomi stepped into the lobby with a calm that surprised her, carrying a portfolio whose pages had been inked in small, honest labor. She is no longer a woman rehearsing to be seen. She is a woman with receipts of craft. Caroline Sterling met her in a conference room that leaned like a stage toward the river. Caroline was composed, not theatrical but precise, a woman whose handshake held the promise of doors rather than their closing. She listened as Naomi talked about light and human scale, about how events could be vessels for dignity rather than displays. Naomi spoke of resonance, of the women who had stood beneath their own words, of the quiet architecture of belonging. Caroline's eyes brightened with a recognition Naomi had learned to trust, the look of someone who hears a song she knows how to sing. There was one logistical question that no one could avoid, the matter of Ethan Cole. Hartfield and Rowe's partners included Ethan. The team had flagged a potential conflict. Caroline brought it up openly, with the professional grace of someone who preferred clarity to gossip. "We're aware of your past," she said. "We believe in boundaries and in truth. If you join us, you will have the autonomy you need. Her offer came with structure, a title, a budget, and a line manager who reported directly to Caroline. Space and safeguards. Naomi considered the architecture of that promise and weighed it against the narrow, unspoken fear that had once kept her small. She accepted the position, not as revenge, but as reclamation. She would return to the world that had first polished her into an accessory, but on terms she had written. She would not deny the past. She would simply refuse to let it be the story that ended her. The first morning at Hartfield and Row felt like a homecoming with a stranger's key. The elevator rode her past floor after floor of glass and coffee bars. People turned to look, some with polite recognition, some with the small, electric curiosity that follows anyone who has been reborn in public. Naomi's office had a window that framed the river like a living canvas. She placed her sketchbook on the desk and felt the place settle beneath her hands. On the third day, the door opened and Ethan walked in. He moved with a slightly smaller stride than the man she had left. Time had softened some lines and added others. His suit fit, as always, but there was an unfamiliar weariness in the set of his shoulders. He had the look of a man who had been measured by markets and found wanting in private currency. "Naomi," he said, crude in its simplicity and yet heavy with a history neither of them could untether. He sat as though executing impeccable manners rather than seeking absolution. She invited him to take the chair across from her desk. The room smelled faintly of paper and citrus, corporate clean. Sunlight struck the edge of Ethan's watch, and for a beat, Naomi saw the small life she had once kept for him reflected back. Polished, familiar, closed. "I heard the news," he began. "Caroline called. He faltered, that brittle honesty of men unused to owning their quiet cruelties. "I didn't expect this. I read the piece about the summit. It was impressive." Naomi watched him with the soft attention of someone examining an old photograph. There was no triumph in her eyes. There was a calm that belonged to someone who had learned to sit in the truth without inflaming it. "Thank you," she said. "It means something that the work resonated." He folded his hands briefly, as if trying to contain a confession. "I underestimated you," he said at last. "I thought I was helping. I thought—" He stopped. The rest of the sentence had nowhere to go. Naomi's response was measured, the kind of clarity that comes from not being hurried by another's discomfort. "You did not help," she said. "You contained me. You made me smaller for your convenience. That is not assistance. It is ownership dressed as benevolence." There was no shouting. There was only the small human arithmetic of truth laid out between them. Ethan's face moved through regret, then some dawning comprehension, and finally a weary kind of apology that felt belated but sincere. "I'm sorry," he said. "I see that now. I'm trying to understand how to be different." She believed neither the apology nor the slow healing he might attempt. Belief in him was not the point. Her compassion was not for him, but for what he still had to learn about himself. "Learning is good," she said, "but I don't bear the burden of your education." They spoke for a while longer, about logistics, about the space their histories would now occupy, about civility and the boundaries Caroline had placed. It was practical, adult conversation, calendars, deliverables, and the small necessities of two people inhabiting a shared professional orbit after the personal had unraveled. When Ethan rose to leave, he hesitated in the doorway. For an instant, his composure cracked into something like longing. Naomi met it with steadiness and did not step toward it nor away from it. She was not there to collect pieces of a life that had been offered to her in exchange for her selfhood. She was there to do her work. Months into her role, Naomi set a new calendar for Hartfield and Row, an annual series of events that spoke to the firm's stated values: inclusion, dignity, and cultural curiosity. She hired women she admired, cultivated voices that had been marginalized, and designed spaces that coaxed conversation rather than spectacle. People noticed. The firm's reputation, once brittle with old money's polish, began to flex in new, humane ways. At night, in the quiet of her apartment, Naomi folded her sketchbook closed and sometimes allowed herself a private indulgence, imagining a life in which the presence of Ethan was a footnote rather than a headline. She did not seek to be small, nor to erase the past. She simply wanted the right to be whole. The city outside gleamed and moved, indifferent and generous. In that movement she found her own rhythm, work that mattered, colleagues who respected her, and a clear line between the life she had once inhabited and the life she was building. The return, she discovered, was less about confronting ghosts and more about the steady business of presence. Walking through the office one morning, she passed a wall where photographs of Hartfield and Rose events hung like a small museum of intention. In one of them, a woman stood beneath the lights Naomi had chosen, eyes closed in a moment of simple grace. Naomi recognized the line of her shoulder in the silhouette and smiled, not for victory, but for continuity. She had come back, yes, but she had not returned to the same person. The reckoning arrived not as thunder, but as the precise, inevitable exhale that follows a held breath. It was a morning threaded with frost and sunlight, the kind of cold clarity that strips distractions from the world and leaves only the essential shapes of things. Naomi walked into the boardroom on the 42nd floor with a stack of slides and a quiet steadiness that had become her signature. Today, the firm's partners had gathered to review the year's programming. Today, she would stand where many had once expected her to soften and nod, and instead she would speak. The room smelled faintly of citrus and coffee. Men in dark coats arranged themselves with the practiced choreography of people accustomed to performance. Ethan sat near the head of the table, the ring of his calendar a neat punctuation at his wrist. There was no theatricality in his glance as Naomi sat up, only a hesitation that might have been curiosity, or the thin unraveling of self-regard when faced with the life one has helped make small. Naomi began with metrics, attendance figures, donor retention, the surprising uptick in talent recruitment since the reboot of the events program. Her voice was calm, exact. The numbers were his own language translated into the terms he respected. But the slides were not her only instrument. She threaded each statistic with portraits and small testimonies. A woman who'd been hired after a mentorship lunch. A community leader who'd been included in a client dinner because Naomi insisted the table should represent more than old alliances. A young coordinator who had been given a chance to manage an entire evening and, in doing so, had found a vocation. As she spoke, she watched the room shift. The metrics caught attention, yes, but it was the human accents, the glances exchanged when she read a quote aloud, the softening that accompanied the image of a voice reclaimed, that made the air unfamiliar. Naomi felt a deliberate tenderness beneath her tone. She was not there to shame, only to illuminate the cost of choices and the profit of a different kind of courage. Halfway through, she paused and told a story. Not a scandal, nothing theatrical, a remembrance. There was a woman, she said, who once organized a strategy dinner and then was told, in a boardroom, that her place was at home. She kept designing rooms while her notebooks gathered dust. She was dismissed because someone else wanted a prettier surface. Her eyes met Ethan's for the briefest beat. A contact neither accusatory nor seeking absolution, merely true. In that look lay a ledger of time and consequence. Ethan's jaw clenched, a private contraction of someone recognizing the trace of their hand on another person's life. He glanced down. For a moment, Naomi thought he might rise and leave the room. He did not. Instead, he folded his fingers and listened. When Naomi finished, silence settled like a soft cloth. Then Caroline Sterling, whose business sense had the patience of a woman who trusted systems over theatrics, asked the question no one had asked before. What would it cost us to build this into our standard practice? Not CSR theater, but structural change. Hiring pipelines, mentorship budgets, real accountability. A conversation unspooled that had the unusual cadence of genuine inquiry. People who had once been comfortable with their assumptions found their language retooled. Barriers were named without rancor. Apologies that mattered were proposed not as gestures but as frameworks. Commitments to hiring targets. The creation of a fund to support emerging talent from underrepresented backgrounds. A review of partner conduct policies. The firm began, in that hour, to imagine a version of itself where dignity and profit were not opposites. Later, after the meeting had dissolved into practicalities and HR had begun drafting proposals, Ethan asked Naomi to walk with him for a few minutes. The hallway was quiet, sunlight falling in bars across the marble. He spoke with the clumsy sincerity of a man learning to feel in public. "I read your deck last night," he said. "I didn't know how much I didn't understand. I see it now, Naomi. I see what I took." His voice was small, weary as a man who had been forced to meet his own reflection without the benefit of filters. Naomi listened. She had long ago learned that the need to be forgiven was not her burden to carry. "Acknowledgement is a beginning," she said, choosing her words with the tender precision she used in her designs. "Understanding is a process. Change happens in persistent daily choices." She did not offer the balm of an easy absolution. There was no dramatic rupture of reconciliation. Not yet, perhaps never. But there was a clarity she offered instead. The map of what would be needed for repair. Ethan's reckoning unfolded over months. It was not a single fall or a public shaming. It was the slow contraction of the comforts he had once taken for granted. Partners who had once deferred to him began to ask different questions. Some of his old allies felt the strain of the firm's directional pivot and drifted away. He began therapy, at Naomi's quiet knowledge, because she had seen something in him beyond resentment. A man who might learn the language of humility if he chose to listen. For Naomi, the reckoning had another dimension. The inner accounting she performed each night in the quiet of her apartment. She weighed her choice to stay at Hartfield & Row, a company attempting to change, from the moral calculus of complicity versus transformation. She counseled teams, attended policy meetings, and ensured that the commitments discussed in the boardroom translated into real roles, real budgets, and enforceable timelines. Her work became a ledger of remediations, internships created, performance measures redefined, mentorship programs funded. It was both tedious and holy. There were days of doubt. She heard whispers in corridors, felt the tired sighs of colleagues who feared upheaval. She received anonymous notes, some grateful, some resentful. Each missive landed like pebbles on a still pond, and each time she felt the ripple and then let it pass. The reckoning was not neat. It had jagged edges and required a steadiness she did not always feel. But she kept returning to the same center. Design that honors people. Power wielded in service rather than spectacle. One evening, months after that first boardroom, she walked into a small event the firm hosted to celebrate the pilot of its new mentorship initiative. The room was modest but alive. Mentees walking in with the cautious light of those newly seen. Mentors greeting them with the deliberate warmth Naomi had insisted upon. Ethan stood in a corner and watched, his face softened by the humility of someone who had been invited to witness rather than direct. A young woman came to Naomi that night, her smile shy, her hands nervous, and said simply, "Because of this program, I'm going back to school." Her voice was steady, but Naomi felt her throat tighten. It was a small victory, a single axis upon which so much pivoted. She thought of the woman she had been, the long, patient labor of regrowth, and the way change had finally begun to look less like retribution and more like repair. The reckoning had, for Naomi, moved beyond the personal. It had become civic, a gentle remapping of a world where wounds were acknowledged and systems redesigned to heal rather than hide them. It was not a story of a single villain punished, but of an institution learning, messily, imperfectly, to account for its failures. At night, when the city settled and headlights turned the river into a ribbon of light, Naomi would sometimes pause by her window and breathe. The quiet had a new texture now, the weight of responsibility balanced against the lightness of accomplishment. Change, she had learned, was neither sudden nor solitary. It was a series of patient reckonings, each one demanding courage in its own register. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, felt the future not as an absence to be feared, but as a horizon she had helped redraw. The office lights dimmed at dusk, leaving behind a quiet hum, the kind that fills buildings where work and purpose have begun to blend into something more human. From her glass-walled office, Naomi looked out over Manhattan. The skyline was a cathedral of steel and light, each window glowing like a small heartbeat in the city's vast body. She stood there for a long moment, her reflection overlaying the river, thinking of how far she had come, from silence to speech, from invisibility to resonance. The firm had changed in ways both tangible and delicate. The mentorship program she had helped establish had grown roots. Policies once drafted in abstract language now lived in real people's lives. Women who had once whispered their frustrations in elevators now spoke openly in meetings. Projects were staffed with diversity that was more than performative. Naomi no longer had to fight to prove why humanity belonged in the architecture of commerce. Now others carried that conviction too. But with growth came growing pains. There were new voices in the room now, voices that did not always agree, that argued with passion and occasionally with hurt. The work of transformation, Naomi had learned, was not peaceful. It was noisy, alive, and beautifully uncomfortable. One late afternoon, she sat in a roundtable discussion with junior associates and community partners, listening as they debated the direction of a new initiative. "We talk about inclusion," one young woman said, "but who decides what that looks like? Sometimes it feels like even our progress is designed by people who already have power." The words hung in the air. Naomi felt them land, sharp, true, necessary. She could have defended her work, could have explained the logistics and the limits of what institutions allowed. Instead, she nodded slowly. "You're right," she said. "Even good intentions can cast long shadows. Tell me what you see from where you stand." The conversation that followed was raw and luminous. Ideas spilled across the table like sunlight breaking through blinds. Pay transparency, flexible mentorship models, cross-cultural partnerships. Naomi took notes quietly, her pen moving with reverence. She was no longer the only voice of reform, and that realization filled her with a complex, unexpected joy. This was the next evolution, when one person's awakening became a collective vocabulary. Outside of work, Naomi began to speak publicly again, not from podiums, but in spaces where dialogue was more intimate. Art collectives, universities, small nonprofits. She spoke about design as empathy, about how spaces teach people what they are worth. In one lecture hall, a student asked, "Do you ever get tired of carrying other people's voices?" Naomi smiled. "They don't weigh me down," she said softly. "They lift me. Every voice I've helped amplify gives me one more to rest my own upon." Her work began to ripple outward. Articles about the firm's transformations circulated across industries, but more importantly, other organizations began to reach out. A museum in Chicago requested her guidance for a new exhibit centered on women artists of the African diaspora. A social innovation firm in London wanted to collaborate on a global design exchange. Naomi accepted selectively, not out of ambition, but out of fidelity to depth over breadth. Each project had to matter. Each had to listen. In Lisbon, Helena wrote to her often. "The city misses you," her letters said, "but it's proud of you." Naomi would smile at the familiar handwriting and sometimes, in rare quiet hours, imagine herself walking again through the steep, sunlit alleys of Alfama. That city had taught her how to rebuild. New York, she realized, had taught her how to lead. One evening, at a community forum held in Harlem, Naomi listened to a panel of young artists discussing representation in architecture. Their words were bold, unguarded, threaded with the same urgency she once felt when sketching her first designs in secret notebooks. When the moderator invited her to speak, Naomi hesitated before stepping to the microphone. She looked at the audience, faces luminous in the soft stage light, a tapestry of ages, colors, and histories, and began quietly. "I used to think one voice could change a room," she said, "and maybe, in some small ways, it can. But I've learned that the real transformation happens when that voice multiplies, when it becomes a harmony." She spoke of Lisbon, of the women who had lifted her from her own wreckage. She spoke of Leonore, whose laughter had felt like sunlight, of the artists who had shown her how beauty could survive ruin. And she spoke of the people before her, students, colleagues, strangers, whose courage to speak had reshaped the very foundation she once thought unshakable. "My voice was never meant to be alone," she said, It was meant to join yours. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was warm, like a tide coming in, steady, shared, inevitable. Afterward, a young man approached her. He was nervous, his hands clutching a notebook full of sketches. "I don't have the right words," he said, "but I think I want to build things that make people feel safe." Naomi smiled, her heart full with something beyond pride. "Then you already have the right beginning," she said. As the months unfolded, Naomi watched the movement she had sparked become self-sustaining. Colleagues launched their own projects, mentorship circles expanded beyond the firm, and initiatives sprouted in cities she had never been to. The work no longer needed her in every room. It had taken on its own life, its own collective pulse. That, she realized, was the true measure of impact, not permanence, but propagation. Sometimes late at night she returned to her sketchbook. Its pages had grown thick with years of lines, ink, and graphite, proof of a life drawn in revision. One evening she found herself sketching something new. Not a building or a stage, but an open space with dozens of figures standing in a circle, all facing one another. No podium, no spotlight, just light shared equally among them. It was the purest thing she had ever drawn. The next morning, she brought the sketch to the office and pinned it to the wall of her workspace. Beneath it, she wrote 3 simple words: "The voice of many." It became her quiet manifesto, the phrase she used to guide new programs, mentor new designers, and remind herself that no voice, however powerful, was meant to stand alone. And when she walked through the city, past murals painted on brick walls, past classrooms where young girls discussed architecture and justice, she sometimes caught the faint echo of her own words, spoken in other voices, reshaped and reimagined. It was then she knew she had become more than visible. She had become plural. The night before the summit's closing ceremony, Naomi stood alone on the rooftop of Hartfield in Row, the city unfolding beneath her like an illuminated script she had learned, line by trembling line, to read without fear. The wind carried the scent of rain and warm pavement, New York's private perfume, and the skyscrapers glowed like sentinels watching over the restless world below. She had arrived in this city with a suitcase full of fragile beginnings. She would leave it tonight, having written an ending that felt like a beginning all its own. Tomorrow's ceremony would mark the firm's first global initiative built entirely on her philosophy: design as empathy, leadership as stewardship, and power as a shared instrument. Delegates from 20 countries would gather in a circular hall she had shaped with her own hands and heart. There would be no stage, no podium, only a constellation of chairs arranged so that no one was higher than another. It had taken her 2 years to persuade the board, but they had said yes. And tonight, alone in the soft hum of the city, she let herself feel the truth she had never dared to believe as a younger woman. She had become a force. Not by shouting, not by bending herself into shapes others preferred, but by refusing to be diminished, by learning to stand in her certainty without apology. A soft chime rang from the elevator. Naomi turned. Ethan stepped onto the rooftop, the door clicking shut behind him. He looked different now, not diminished, but humanized. A man stripped of myth, a man who had rebuilt himself, slowly, painfully, away from the shadows he once cast. "I heard you were up here," he said. She nodded. Last-minute quiet before the storm. Ethan moved to stand beside her, leaving a careful space between them. "I wanted to say something before tomorrow," he said, his voice low, vulnerable. "I've been doing the work, the uncomfortable kind. And I know apologies don't rebuild the past, but I need you to hear this. You changed me. You didn't owe me that, and yet, you did." Naomi looked at him, not the man who once confined her, but the man learning to unmake his inheritance of arrogance. "I'm glad you're trying," she said gently, "but my story isn't about you anymore. It hasn't been for a long time." A small, rueful smile touched his lips. "I know." They stood in silence, watching the river shimmer like molten metal beneath the night sky. At last, Ethan nodded, stepped back, and returned to the elevator. He left without asking for forgiveness. And Naomi felt, in the quiet that followed, a freedom so spacious it could have lifted her off the ground. She returned inside, knowing sleep would not come. Instead, she walked through the empty halls of the building, touching the edges of rooms she had once entered with her pulse racing. Now they opened for her like familiar chapters. When dawn broke, the summit began. The circular hall filled with voices, soft, bold, trembling, powerful. Women from Lagos, Seoul, Lisbon, Rio, Toronto. Men who believed in rebuilding. Artists, activists, leaders, students. Each person carried a story, and each story added a ripple to the room's living pulse. Naomi welcomed them from the center, not as an authority, but as a witness. She wore no spotlight. Her voice moved through the room like warm wind, steady and tender. When I arrived in Lisbon, she said, I had lost everything I thought I needed to survive. But in that city of ruins, I learned something I never expected. You don't rebuild by becoming harder. You rebuild by becoming truer. The room breathed with her. I stand here today not fearless because I have never been afraid, but fearless because I have chosen not to run from myself anymore. And I hope this space gives you permission to choose the same. A hush fell, one of those rare, holy silences where hearts align. Then the conversations began, voices rising, overlapping, braiding into a tapestry of shared vision. Naomi walked among them, listening, learning, passing the microphone but never keeping it. The circle lived exactly as she had hoped, a chorus of many, a room without hierarchy, an architecture of belonging. When the day ended, people lingered, not out of obligation but out of connection. Some hugged her with tears still shining. Others thanked her quietly. A few simply placed their hands over their hearts as they passed her. Naomi stepped outside into the evening air, the sky streaked with gold. She felt neither triumph nor exhaustion. She felt arrival, the final piece of a puzzle she had been assembling since the night everything fell apart. She walked to the river, the same river she had once stared into in Atlanta years ago, broken and trying to remember her own name. Now she whispered it into the wind, Naomi, and the world seemed to whisper it back. Fearless didn't mean invincible. It meant unhidden, self-owned, whole. She stood tall, her silhouette etched against the city's shimmering light, and felt the next chapter calling, not as necessity, but as invitation. And as this story of hers draws toward its resting place, let it linger in your hands for a moment. Because stories like Naomi's are reminders, gentle, radiant ones, that we can rise from ashes not to reclaim what was lost, but to become something more expansive, more luminous than we ever imagined. If this journey moved you, let your voice join it. Leave a comment, tap like, follow the channel. Let's keep building these stories together. Your voice too can become fearless.